Hi, welcome back to PySimpleGUI 2020, Part 10. We're into double digits, generated layouts. There are going to be a couple of concepts that we're going to cover here. One is user-defined elements. And what is meant by that is a function that you can put into your layout. So far we've talked about layouts that have elements like text and button and input. User-defined elements means that we're going to create functions that we are going to put directly into this layout. Those functions will return elements, so it's not like we're creating or using Tkinter widgets directly, something like that. It's just a term that I try to use to describe the fact that you are creating your own version, in a way, of an element with settings. So let me get into an example here. So we've got a layout here to enter a name, address, and phone number. This is the window and this is the layout. It's a nice looking little screen. There are a few reasons behind that. One is that we've justified our text labels. We've used different sized fonts. We've made these fixed width so that they all line up real nice. And our layout isn't too bad looking, except that it's got a lot of parameters, and they're copied over and over again. And if this was a much larger window, and you had 30 lines of this, then it would just start to look very cluttered. And that's usually, in computer science terms, a time to refactor and to use a function if you're copying things a lot. So that's what we're going to do here. And so that whenever you create one of these user-defined elements, what you want to look at is what is common and what is changing between what you're building. In other words, what are the kind of parameters to pass in? So if we were to make one of these rows, well, the things that change are the text and the key that goes with the input. So that will be two of the parameters. So let's say that we're going to call this input info, right? And it's going to have text and a key. And let's take one of these, and we're going to return essentially one of those rows, right? And instead of name here, we're going to have text. And instead of having a hard-coded key down here, we're going to have key, right? And then instead of these rows, we'll just have info, and here it will have name, and the key is dash name, and I've misspelled in info. Let's do that. We'll do the copy paste method here. Name, address, and phone, and our keys are the same sort of thing. Name, address, and phone. Let's delete this. Now that's a nicer looking layout, right? And we've not, it's not like we've lost a lot here. We know that this is a user-defined element because it doesn't have an SG in front of it. And it's easy to find. It's right there. And when we run this, it's going to crash, of course. because I'm sure I did something wrong. Let's see what we did.
The time is 8:00 p.m.
Okay, so what has happened is that I've left a comma up here, and that's a really insidious kind of bug. Okay, so now let's run this again, and this time we have our nice window, and it's got a much nicer layout. We've got one place now to change. If we want to make this, say, 10, we've got one place to change instead of 3 places to change. It's much better coding style overall. We've used an encapsulation there. So the other thing that we're going to talk about here is generated layouts. And it's sort of similar in a way, right? We're not going to use a traditional list of lists layout. Instead, we're going to build one. So there are several ways to do this in Python. One is to use append to build a list. So we're using loops. The other will be using list comprehensions. So here, what we're building is a grid, a 5x5 grid of buttons. And there are a couple of things I want to point out in this. One is that the key that we're doing here is a tuple instead of a string. I've seen so many programs where people have jumped through hoops to encode row column information into a string, and then in their event loop they parse the string to get the info back. The important part here is that keys can be anything, or just about anything. They can't be a list, but they can be a tuple. So what we've done here is created a 5x5 list by taking buttons and appending them to an empty list. So that gives us a row, and then we took the row and appended it to an empty list, so that we ended up with a row of rows, which is a layout. I mean, a list of lists, which is a layout. And then we used Python's addition operator to add a list onto our list of lists. So we added on the OK and cancel button to the bottom of this layout. So this part up here is computed. This part down here is this addition. And I have here in comments a couple of things. One is that there is a section in the PySimpleGUI documentation on generated layouts that goes through this concept at great length, and also talks about user generated elements or compound elements. So you can get it from the main documentation as well as this tutorial. The other thing here is the list operators that are good to use when creating or working with layouts. So one you've seen here, which is that if you've got this first one, layout plus layout concatenation. So let's say here that I've got layout equals just some text. This will take a plain layout and it's going to add another row onto the end. That's easy enough. The next kind of layout list addition stuff is that if you have a list and you add another list to it, then you'll it will add it as if it's on the same row. So here is a row. Let me list our window. Here's a row, and it looks like it would start another row, but it's adding. It's not a comma, so it's adding. So it's going to add to the same row that's there. And this will come in handy with list comprehensions. In fact, let's do a list comprehension right here. Let's say that I wanted to have 6 buttons after this. B is for button, by the way. And I tend to use the shortened abbreviations, like text is T, especially when working with these list comprehensions kind of things. So let's see what we have for I and range of 5. So here we've got a list comprehension, and it's going to build a list of buttons. And let's have the text be a number. And when we run this, we're going to see on one row some text and then 5 buttons. So by using the addition here like this, we're able to mix normal elements with a generated elements using a list comprehension, and it's on a single row versus it being on multiple rows. Hope that makes sense. So that's the first two. We have one layout plus another layout equals a layout. Here, one row plus another row is a row. List comprehension to generate a row, which is what we just did, right? And then we can do list comprehensions to generate rows of elements. So let's do a list comprehension to generate a row of elements. So here is a list, a layout with just text. And let's say that we want our layout to now have rows of buttons instead of just buttons. And that's where we're going to concatenate a layout, and instead of the button being by itself, we're going to have the button be on a list by itself, like that. So this will generate, I took off one too many of these, I think. Hang on, let me. Okay, so here we have our original layout, which has a single row of text. Then we're adding a layout that is a list comprehension that is a list of buttons. So you see this is a button that's in a list, and the list comprehension is making lists. And then we're going to add OK and cancel to it. So now when we run this, we'll see our text at the top, and then these buttons going down because they are on individual rows because they're each a list. And then at the bottom we have our OK and cancel. So put together here, it's a very compact sort of layout, even though there's a list comprehension involved and we're computing things. So in list comprehensions, you can have not just a single loop, but you can do nested list comprehension. So here we've got a grid of buttons that we're going to make. And let's take a peek at how this is going to work. I'm going to put an extra space so that you can see that this right here is one list. So that's a row. And then the outer one is the overall layout. So it's a list of lists. Right, so we have on a row, we've got 3 buttons, and then we're generating 4 of those rows. So when we run this, we will see we have 3 buttons per column, and we have 4 rows worth. Now notice the key is R and C for row column. And so whenever I click a button, let's say this one, I've got a print here for event and values, and the event that came back was 1, 0. So row 1, looks like I got them numbered backwards. Yeah, I do. Sorry. Got my row columns swapped. So let's switch this. I think that's the way we want them. And so that this is 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, right? So it's 0 through 3, and then 0 through 2. Pretty nifty, huh? So you're getting up with this nice grid based solely on a single line of code. We talked about pad in a previous episode as well. Let's set the pad to 0, 0 for this. And run it again. Then it'll make our grid of buttons very tight. You may find this handy to do in like a Minesweeper game or something like that. Okay, and then the last thing I want to show you here is a Sudoku game, or at least a game board. And that would be this line of code. So when we run this, what we get is this Sudoku board. It's filled in with random numbers, so it's not a valid board. But the point is that in PySimpleGUI, it's possible to take a single line of code and have it generate something that looks really nice and actually run it. I mean, it'll take input. You know, it's not like it's just a static image. And as soon as I hit the exit button or close the window, this read will return. But digging in here for just a second, this is our title, this is our layout, and it is a list comprehension of frames. So this is a frame that has the line around it, and within the frame there's a list comprehension happening of inputs. So this there's row call for doing the input list comprehension, and then there's an outer list comprehension that's doing f call and f row, which I've had for frame row and frame column. So it generates these frames, and then I added on the exit button. So these generated layouts are really a place that PySimpleGUI can shine. It is so easy to make rows of buttons and use Python constructs like list comprehensions and apply them to GUIs. And you just can't do that with other GUI frameworks. It's, I think, unique to PySimpleGUI. It was written in Python for Python, and this is the fun thing about Python, is to be able to do these kinds of things. So hopefully you found this instructive. Thank you for watching.